On the morning of August 9th, 1945, the sun rose over Tokyo with an almost mocking tranquility. In the basement conference room of the Imperial Palace, 7 of the most powerful men in Japan sat around a polished table, their faces drawn with exhaustion, still processing reports from Hiroshima that defied comprehension. They believed they had 3 more days, perhaps a week, before the Americans could possibly deploy another weapon. They were convinced that one bomb represented years of industrial effort, that surely no nation could produce such devices in rapid succession. Within hours, every assumption they held about the nature of warfare, about the limits of human destruction, and about their own nation's future would be shattered beyond recognition. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What unfolded in those conference rooms over the next 72 hours would reveal not just the end of a global conflict, but the fundamental transformation of how human beings understood power itself. The conversations that took place, preserved through testimonies, diaries, and declassified documents, show us men grappling with the impossible, forced to confront a reality that no military training, no political experience, and no philosophical framework had prepared them to face. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai had arrived at the palace that morning with a folder of reports that seemed to belong to another century. At 65 years old, he had spent 4 decades in naval service, rising through ranks during an era when battleships determined the fate of empires. He had opposed the conflict from its inception, had warned repeatedly about the industrial capacity of the United States, and had quietly worked behind the scenes to find a path toward ending hostilities. As he took his seat at the conference table, he glanced at the faces around him and recognized the same haunted expression on each one. General Korochika Anami sat directly across from him, the war minister, whose muscular frame and rigid posture seemed almost defiant against the weight of recent events. At 58, Anami represented the faction that believed in fighting to the last man, in transforming the home islands into a fortress that would exact such a terrible price that any invading force would be compelled to negotiate. He had spent the past 3 days arguing that Hiroshima, while devastating, was not decisive, that the Americans surely could not possess more than 1 or 2 of these weapons, and that Japan's honor demanded continued resistance. Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo occupied the seat nearest the door, his slight frame and wire-rimmed spectacles giving him an almost professorial appearance. At 63, he had spent his career in diplomacy, serving in posts across Europe and Asia, and had returned to government service specifically to find a way to end the conflict through negotiation. He had been working through neutral channels, particularly the Soviet Union, hoping to secure terms that would preserve the imperial institution and spare his nation the humiliation of unconditional surrender. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki presided over the meeting with the weary authority of a man who had already lived several lifetimes. At 77, he was the oldest person in the room, a former admiral who had survived an assassination attempt during the military coup of 1936, taking multiple gunshot wounds that left him partially deaf. He had accepted the position of Prime Minister just 4 months earlier, understanding that his role would be to guide Japan toward an end to hostilities, though the path remained obscure. Navy Minister Mitsumasa Yonai, General Yoshijiro Umezu, Baron Kiichiro Hiranuma, and several other senior officials completed the assembly. They represented the Supreme Council for the direction of the conflict, the inner cabinet that held Japan's fate in their hands. For 3 days, since the first reports from Hiroshima had begun filtering into Tokyo, they had been locked in debate, their positions hardening, even as the evidence of catastrophe accumulated. The meeting had been scheduled to continue discussions about potential surrender terms, about the conditions Japan might seek through Soviet mediation, about the preservation of the emperor and the kokutai, the national polity that defined Japanese identity. General Anami had been preparing his arguments about the necessity of one final decisive engagement, about the millions of soldiers still under arms, about the kamikaze squadrons ready to sacrifice themselves against any invasion fleet. He believed, genuinely believed, that Japan could still extract acceptable terms through the demonstration of absolute resolve. Then the door opened. and a junior officer entered with a message that would render all their preparations meaningless. The first report was fragmentary, almost incomprehensible. Communications with Nagasaki had ceased. Initial accounts suggested another massive explosion, similar in character to what had occurred at Hiroshima. The officer's hands trembled slightly as he presented the document, and the men around the table fell into a silence so complete that the ticking of the wall clock seemed to echo like artillery. Admiral Yonai was the first to speak. His voice was barely above a whisper as he said that this changed everything, that their calculations about American capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. He looked directly at General Anami as he spoke, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement that the ground had shifted beneath their feet in ways that could not be ignored. General Anami's response revealed the turmoil beneath his composed exterior. He insisted that they needed confirmation, that reports from Hiroshima had been confused and contradictory for nearly a full day, that they could not make decisions based on incomplete information. But even as he spoke, his voice carried a quality it had not possessed before, a slight wavering that those who knew him well had never witnessed. Foreign Minister Togo seized the moment. He declared that this was precisely what he had warned about, that the Americans possessed industrial resources beyond anything Japan could match, that waiting for Soviet mediation while such weapons continued to fall was not strategy, but collective suicide. His words were sharp, almost accusatory, and General Umezu responded with visible anger, insisting that one more weapon meant nothing against the resolve of 100 million hearts beating as one. Prime Minister Suzuki raised his hand for silence, and the room gradually quieted. He was a man of few words, had earned his reputation through decades of service rather than oratory, and when he spoke, others listened. He said simply that they would wait for confirmation, that they would reconvene when they understood what had actually occurred, but that every man in that room should spend the intervening hours contemplating what a third weapon would mean, and a fourth, and a fifth. The meeting adjourned, but no one left the palace. They scattered to various offices and anterooms, making telephone calls, summoning subordinates, trying to pierce the fog of confusion that surrounded events 200 kilometers to the southwest. The communication networks had been disrupted, and reports filtered in through military channels, through police stations in surrounding prefectures, through fishing vessels that had witnessed something unprecedented from the waters of the bay. Lieutenant Colonel Masao Kusunoki was among the first military officers to reach the outskirts of Nagasaki, having been dispatched from a nearby installation to assess the situation. His initial radio reports, received in Tokyo in the early afternoon, painted a picture that even those who had studied Hiroshima found difficult to absorb. He described approaching the city from the east, expecting to see the familiar industrial landscape dominated by the Mitsubishi shipyards and weapons factories, and instead finding a wasteland that bore no resemblance to any human habitation. Kusunoki's voice crackled through the static as he reported that everything within approximately 2 kilometers of the explosion point had simply ceased to exist. Not destroyed, not damaged, but erased as though it had never been. He described fires burning in a vast ring around this central zone, buildings that had been concrete and steel reduced to rubble, and a silence that was somehow more terrible than any sound of destruction could have been. When asked about casualties, Kusunoki paused for nearly 30 seconds before responding. He said that he could not estimate numbers, that the human form itself had been transformed in ways he lacked vocabulary to describe, that he had found shadows burned into stone walls where people had been standing when the light came. His report ended with a simple statement that whoever possessed such weapons possessed the world itself, and that Japan needed to understand this truth before more cities disappeared. This report reached the conference room within minutes of its transmission, and the effect on those assembled was visible and immediate. Admiral Yonai later wrote in his diary that he watched the color drain from General Anami's face as the words were read aloud, that for just a moment the warrior's mask slipped, and beneath it was simply a man confronting the unimaginable. The debate that followed was unlike any that had occurred in Japanese governance. These were not discussions of strategy or resources or diplomatic maneuvering. They were men arguing about the nature of existence itself, about whether concepts like honor and national spirit had any meaning when a single aircraft could erase a city in the time between one heartbeat and the next. General Anami marshaled his arguments with the discipline of a lifetime of military service. He acknowledged that the weapons were terrible beyond precedent, but insisted that the Americans could not possess unlimited numbers of them, that the resources required must be staggering, that Japan had only to endure until the stockpile was exhausted. He spoke of the homeland defenses, of the mountains and beaches that would become fortresses, of the spirit of the Japanese people that no material force could extinguish. Foreign Minister Togo responded with statistics that landed like physical impacts. He cited American industrial production figures that he had studied throughout the conflict. The numbers of aircraft, ships, and vehicles that flowed from factories in quantities Japan could never match. He argued that if America could build 400,000 aircraft over 4 years, could construct a naval fleet larger than all other nations combined, could transport millions of soldiers across 2 oceans while simultaneously supplying allied nations, then there was no reason to believe they could not produce these new weapons in similar abundance. Navy Minister Yonai added his voice to Togo's position, but with a different emphasis. He spoke not of production numbers, but of what he had observed in the eyes of young officers over the past 3 days. He said that something had broken, that the certainty that had sustained the Japanese military through years of sacrifice had been replaced by something else, and that continuing the conflict when that spirit was compromised would accomplish nothing but additional death. General Umezu countered that surrender would mean the end of Japan itself, that the Kokutai would be destroyed, that the emperor would be deposed or possibly executed, that the nation would be dismembered and its people reduced to servitude. He spoke of the Potsdam Declaration, of unconditional surrender, of the humiliation that awaited a proud nation that laid down its arms without extracting any guarantees for its future. The argument circled and spiraled, the same points made with increasing desperation, the same counterpoints offered with diminishing conviction. Through it all, Prime Minister Suzuki listened, occasionally asking a question, sometimes nodding at a particular point, but mostly simply present, allowing the process to unfold. What made this debate extraordinary was not just the stakes involved, but the transformation occurring within the participants themselves. These were men who had spent their entire careers in a world defined by certain assumptions about power, about conflict, about the relationship between material strength and national will. In the space of 3 days, those assumptions had been revealed as obsolete, as irrelevant to a new reality they were only beginning to comprehend. General Anami understood this perhaps better than he allowed himself to express. His arguments for continued resistance grew more technical, more focused on specific defensive preparations and resource allocations, and less on the grand themes of national spirit and honorable sacrifice that had defined his earlier positions. When he spoke of the 2.5 million soldiers still under arms in the home islands, his voice carried an undertone of something almost like pleading, as though he were trying to convince himself as much as his colleagues. By evening, as the full scope of the Nagasaki devastation became clearer through accumulating reports, the council remained deadlocked. 3 members favored immediate acceptance of the Potsdam terms, with the sole condition of preserving the emperor. 3 others insisted that additional conditions were essential, including self-disarmament, no occupation of the home islands, and Japanese control over any accountability processes. Prime Minister Suzuki could break the tie, but he hesitated, understanding that a decision of such magnitude required something more than a simple majority. It was at this point that Foreign Minister Togo made a suggestion that would have been unthinkable just days earlier. He proposed that the matter be brought before the emperor himself, that His Majesty be asked to make the decision that the council could not reach. This was extraordinary because the emperor's role, in theory, was to ratify decisions made by his government, not to make them himself. For more than 2,000 years, the imperial institution had maintained its legitimacy, partly by remaining above the direct exercise of political power, yet circumstances had moved beyond precedent. Admiral Yonai supported the proposal immediately, recognizing that the emperor represented the only authority that could end the deadlock without destroying the government itself. General Anami resisted. understanding that Emperor Hirohito had already privately expressed his desire for peace, and that bringing him into the decision would effectively settle the matter. But resistance was futile against the growing consensus, and arrangements were made for an imperial conference the following day. That night, as Tokyo slept fitfully under blackout conditions, the individual members of the council confronted their thoughts in private. Admiral Yonai wrote in his diary that he felt something like relief, that the terrible responsibility might finally be lifted, that decisions beyond any one person's wisdom were about to be made by the only authority capable of making them. General Anami spent the night in his office, speaking with subordinates about defensive preparations that he must have known would never be implemented, maintaining the posture of resistance even as its foundations crumbled beneath him. Foreign Minister Togo drafted cables to Japanese representatives in neutral countries, preparing the diplomatic groundwork for what he believed was now inevitable. He knew that the coming days would require delicate navigation, that the conditions of surrender would need to be communicated clearly enough to preserve what could be preserved while accepting what had to be accepted. His thoughts turned to the emperor, to the institution that had given Japan its identity for millennia, and to the paramount necessity of ensuring its survival through whatever was coming. Prime Minister Suzuki sat alone in his study, contemplating the weight of the moment. He had lived through the transformation of Japan from feudal isolation to modern power, had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, had survived assassination when younger men had died around him. Now, at 77, he would preside over either the destruction of his nation or its salvation, and the path between those outcomes was barely visible in the darkness. The Imperial Conference convened on the morning of August 10th in the underground shelter beneath the Imperial Library, a cramped space reinforced against air raids and accessible through a narrow staircase. The Emperor sat at the head of a simple table, wearing his military uniform despite the stifling heat, his face composed, but his eyes carrying the weight of what he was about to do. The arguments were presented again, more briefly this time, the positions already well known. General Anami made his case for continued resistance, his voice steady, his logic precise, but the passion that had animated his earlier speeches was absent. When he spoke of honor and sacrifice, the words seemed to come from memory rather than conviction, as though he were fulfilling an obligation rather than advocating a belief. Foreign Minister Togo presented the case for acceptance, emphasizing the preservation of the imperial institution as the essential goal, the one non-negotiable condition that justified accepting the Potsdam terms. He spoke of the weapons that had destroyed 2 cities, of the possibility of more weapons falling on more cities, of a future in which Japan simply ceased to exist as a functioning nation. His voice cracked slightly as he described reports from Nagasaki, and he paused to collect himself before continuing. When both sides had spoken, Prime Minister Suzuki turned to the Emperor and asked for his decision. This was the moment that violated all precedent, the moment when the institution that had reigned for 26 centuries would directly exercise political authority for perhaps the first time in its modern history. Emperor Hirohito spoke quietly, his voice barely audible to those at the far end of the table. He said that he had considered the arguments carefully, that he appreciated the sincerity and dedication of all who had spoken, but that continuing the conflict was no longer possible. He spoke of the suffering of his people, of the soldiers who had given everything, of the civilians who had endured privation and fear and death. He said that he could not bear to see that suffering continue, that the time had come to bear the unbearable. The effect of these words on those present was described later by multiple witnesses. Admiral Yonai wept openly, making no attempt to conceal his tears. General Umezu sat rigidly, his jaw clenched so tightly that the muscles stood out like cords. Foreign Minister Togo bowed his head in something that might have been prayer or simply exhaustion finally released. General Anami remained motionless for several seconds after the Emperor finished speaking. Then he rose, approached the imperial presence, and bowed deeply. He said that he accepted the decision, that he would work to ensure its implementation, that the imperial will would be carried out. His voice was steady, but those who knew him well recognized the cost of those words, the death of something essential that had sustained him through decades of service. The conference ended, and the work of surrender began. But the conversations did not stop, could not stop, because what had happened required understanding, and understanding required words, and words seemed inadequate to the reality they were trying to capture. In the days that followed, as communications went out to Japanese forces across Asia and the Pacific, as the diplomatic formalities of surrender were arranged, the members of the Supreme Council continued to talk among themselves and with others about what had happened and what it meant. Admiral Yonai spoke with his staff about the nature of the new weapons, about how they changed not just the specific conflict, but the fundamental character of how nations would relate to each other. He observed that the possession of such power by any nation made traditional military strength irrelevant, that 1,000 battleships and 1,000,000 soldiers meant nothing if a single aircraft could accomplish what they could not. He wondered aloud whether humanity was capable of managing such power, or whether these weapons represented the beginning of an end that would unfold over years or decades. Foreign Minister Togo focused on more immediate concerns, working through the complex protocols of surrender, while simultaneously trying to shape the narrative that would define how Japan understood its defeat. He emphasized that the decision had been made to preserve the nation, that the emperor's intervention had been an act of salvation rather than capitulation, that accepting the unacceptable was itself a form of strength rather than weakness. His efforts would help establish the framework through which Japan would process its experience, though the full work of understanding would take generations. General Anami's conversations in those final days were perhaps the most revealing. He spoke with junior officers about duty and honor, about the meaning of service when service had failed to protect the nation. He listened to their anger and confusion, acknowledged their sense of betrayal, but counseled acceptance of the imperial will. He understood that many would not accept, that some would attempt to reverse the decision through force, and he worked to prevent this while privately sympathizing with the impulse that drove it. On the night of August 14th, after the surrender announcement had been recorded and prepared for broadcast, a group of junior officers attempted a coup. They sought to seize the recording, to prevent the emperor's message from reaching the people, to continue the conflict regardless of the imperial decision. General Anami was aware of the plot and did not join it, but neither did he move decisively to prevent it. When it failed, when the conspirators took their own lives rather than face the consequences of their actions, Anami may have felt that their gesture represented something he could no longer express himself. In the early hours of August 15th, General Anami composed a final document in his office at the War Ministry. He wrote that he apologized to the emperor for his failures, that his crimes deserved 10,000 deaths, that he believed in the eternal life of the empire. Then he took his own life in the traditional manner, ending a career that had spanned decades, with a final act that expressed both acceptance and protest, submission and defiance all at once. The emperor's broadcast reached the Japanese people at noon on August 15th. His voice heard by most of his subjects for the first time. He spoke of enduring the unendurable, of bearing the unbearable, of the need to pave the way for future generations. He did not mention the specific weapons that had destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but everyone listening understood that something fundamental had changed, that the conflict was ending because continuing was no longer possible. In the weeks and months that followed, as occupation forces arrived and the process of reconstruction began, the conversations that had taken place in those palace conference rooms gradually became known. Testimonies were recorded, diaries were preserved, and the historical record slowly assembled from fragments and memories. What emerged was a picture of men facing a reality that exceeded their capacity to understand, struggling to find meaning in events that seemed to belong to nightmare rather than history. Admiral Yonai survived and served briefly in the post-surrender government before retiring to private life. He spent his remaining years writing and reflecting on what had occurred, trying to understand how Japan had arrived at such a pass and what lessons might be drawn from the experience. He died in 1948, having witnessed just enough of the new world to glimpse its outlines without fully comprehending its shape. Foreign Minister Togo was arrested by occupation authorities and tried for his role in the conflict. He argued that he had worked consistently for peace, that he had opposed the initial hostilities, and labored to end them as quickly as possible. He was convicted and sentenced to 20 years, dying in prison in 1950. His efforts to end the conflict overshadowed by his presence in the government that had started it. Prime Minister Suzuki resigned shortly after the surrender broadcast and lived quietly until 1948. His reputation grew in the years after his death, as historians recognized his role in navigating the government toward the imperial conference that ended the conflict. He was seen as the man who had found the path when no path seemed to exist, who had allowed the deadlock to be broken without breaking the government itself. The conversations that took place in those August days continued in a sense for decades afterward, as Japan processed its experience and tried to understand what had happened. The weapons that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki became central to global consciousness, symbols of human capability for self-destruction that demanded new frameworks of thought and governance. What those men said when they found out Nagasaki was gone was ultimately an attempt to find words for the wordless, to impose meaning on events that exceeded meaning. Their arguments about honor and survival, about conditions and acceptance, about the emperor and the nation, were all efforts to maintain coherence in the face of something that shattered coherence. They succeeded in ending the conflict and preserving what could be preserved, but they could not succeed in understanding what they had witnessed, because that understanding would take not years but generations to develop. The final image that remains from those conversations is perhaps Admiral Yonai's observation, recorded in his diary on the night of August 9th, after the full reports from Nagasaki had been received and studied. He wrote that he had thought he understood the nature of power, that 40 years of naval service had taught him how strength was measured and applied. Now he realized that everything he had known was prologue to something else, that the human race had crossed a threshold from which there was no return, and that the only question remaining was whether wisdom would grow as fast as capability, or whether the light that had consumed 2 cities would ultimately consume the world. That question remains unanswered, more than 80 years later. The weapons that ended the Pacific conflict grew in power and proliferated in number, becoming a defining feature of international relations and a constant presence in human consciousness. The conversations that began in those conference rooms beneath the imperial palace continue in different forms, as each generation confronts the same essential problem that confronted those men in August 1945: how to live with power that exceeds the human capacity to control it. Perhaps the most important thing they said, the most significant conclusion that emerged from those terrible days, was expressed in Emperor Hirohito's broadcast and echoed in the subsequent reflections of those who served him. It was the recognition that some forms of strength are actually weakness, that true courage sometimes means accepting what cannot be changed, and that the preservation of life, even at the cost of pride, represents the highest form of duty. General Anami's final gesture represented one response to that terrible equation, the response of a warrior who could not survive the death of what he had served. Admiral Yonai's tears represented another, the response of a man who could accept defeat because he understood that defeat in this case was also deliverance. Both responses were human, both were authentic, and both reflected the magnitude of what had occurred. When they found out Nagasaki was gone, they found out that everything had changed, that the world they had known had ended as surely as those 2 cities, and that whatever came next would be built on foundations none of them had ever imagined. Their words in those moments, their arguments and appeals and silences, were the sounds of men trying to find their footing on ground that had shifted beneath them. The story of what they said is ultimately the story of all of us, facing changes we do not fully understand, trying to make decisions that exceed our wisdom, hoping that the choices we make will prove better than they have any right to be. Their example offers no easy lessons, no simple formulas for navigating impossible circumstances, but it offers something perhaps more valuable, the proof that such circumstances can be navigated, that words can be found even when words fail, and that human beings facing the unimaginable can still find ways to continue. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.